welcome to a new episode of the IT Factor. I'm Dan Krieger, your host. Joining me today is, we know him internally as the Professor, but it's Dan Snape. Hey, Dan.
Hey, DK. How you doing, mate?
Good, mate. Good. So Dan is joining me today. We're going to be talking about all things Exchange. So in the previous episode, as many listeners will know, we talked about what is M365 or Office 365. So today I thought we'd jump straight in and look at one of the core products, and I guess one of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to migrations. So that is migrating Exchange on-prem to Exchange Online. We're going to cover off a few different things, but I thought we'd dive straight into it, Dan, if that's good with you. I would normally ask how people are, but I know that you're just generally awesome. But I will actually ask you, have you had a good week?
So far so good. Yeah. I'm still healthy. No colds or flus or sicknesses, so living the dream.
Nice. Well, let's just dive straight in, and we'll get get the ball rolling. So, as an organisation, if you're looking to migrate to Microsoft 365, and you've identified that obviously email is one of the things that needs to go, as an organisation, what sort of things could they do to prepare for that move? What are some of the sort of first steps, if you like? We as consultants, when we go in, what are the things that we look for in design workshops and these sorts of things that we'd get feedback from the customer on?
Well, the first thing that obviously customers need to think about is where they're coming from. There are a lot of different ways that you can host your email. You might be hosting it in Google, you might have it in some other form of Linux mail server, or you may have it on premises Exchange. So that's the first real thing that you need to think about, because that source location really dictates how you're going to migrate your mail to Exchange Online. Now, Microsoft do support migration from all of those sort of source areas, but what that source looks like, it dictates what the migration looks like as well. So that's the first thing.
Yep.
The next thing then is really around how you want to migrate from that source, like the location. How big is your mail environment? If you've got maybe 50 or 100 users or mailboxes, then you might think about a big bang migration where you sort of migrate everyone at once. If you've got tens of thousands or thousands or even hundreds of thousands of users, then a big bang is not really going to work. You're going to have to do a staged migration. Just because
it's just not practical, right?
Microsoft just can't ingest that amount of data in a quick migration over a weekend even. So they're the sort of two things I'd look at first in just to establish what that migration looks like for your company.
Yep. So we're looking at, and there'll be themes running through all of these podcasts, things like know your data, right? It's integral at the beginning of a project that you have an understanding of what it is that you want to migrate. So if you're, and rightfully so, you point out that there are other platforms other than Exchange Online, Exchange On-Prem, that you'd be migrating from, but having an understanding of not just the user mailboxes, but shared mailboxes, resources, all those types of objects, but then also public folders, whether you're unfortunately stuck with using public folders in your organization. I know Microsoft would really prefer that you didn't, but so having an understanding of your data at the outset is integral, right? You need that even just from a licensing perspective. So understanding what licenses you need are also key. And you mentioned Big Bang versus, I guess, batching up and migrating. So having an understanding of the approach that works best for your organization as well are critical. So what are the next steps once you've got an understanding of the data that you've got that you need to migrate? Do we then start looking at tooling? Like what would be the next step?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess, the most common scenario that we see is where an organization has Exchange on-prem. So then we generally recommend the native tooling. A hybrid migration is the term that's used, and that sort of creates a link between the on-premises organization and Exchange Online, and you can do a migration where users in both those organizations can collaborate effectively like they're in the same Exchange organization, like they haven't migrated. But there are other, as we said before, there are other scenarios where hybrid might not suit. So you might need a third-party tool to do that migration. You might be migrating from Google Mail or Google Workspace or again, some other third-party Exchange environment where you can't put in a hybrid or you can't create that link. So then we can look at that tooling and see what meets the requirements for the organization. Again, as you mentioned before, public folders are a thing. Not all tools do a public folder migration. So if you've got that, you don't want to have multiple tools. So you look at, whether that tooling meets the requirements of migrating public folders. You might want to use a cloud-based tool, or you might want to use an on-premises tool where you install some hardware or software on premises and do the migration using tooling, or cloud-based where it's a total, a software as a service type migration.
Yep.
So yeah, that's definitely once you've got that established, then you can really get down into the design of what that migration looks like.
Yeah, we won't get into the tooling side of things into any great depth in this podcast. We will have a future episode where we'll look at the various tools available. But one of the considering factors around the tools is the peripheral applications or business services that you're using, right? So if you're running SharePoint, if you want to be migrating files into OneDrive, etc. So and then with SharePoint, how advanced your organization leverages the tool. Do you have workflows and custom applications and so on? So those will largely dictate what type of what tool you end up going with, and it certainly narrows down the options, right?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Yeah. So you mentioned hybrid. That is the most common setup that we see. Walk me through what a standard hybrid would look like. We quite often see Exchange 2013, sometimes Exchange 2010. More often than not, 16 or 19. What does that hybrid look like? Can you do it with your existing on-prem infrastructure? Do you need to stand up additional servers? What's the general implementation look like?
Yeah, well, so a hybrid, as I said before, is basically a bunch of settings that are configured both on premises and in the cloud that allow you to share your Exchange on-prem and your Exchange online organizations. So effectively for end users, they seem, or users seem to be in the same organization. So a hybrid is compatible with Exchange versions from 2010 onwards. So anything after 2010 or including 2010, you can run a hybrid environment or configure a hybrid Exchange environment. The caveat there is that all Exchange versions have to be the latest cumulative update or update release. So, or the previous one. So for those versions, you basically need to be very up to date with the updates that you're installing on Exchange.
So a quick question on that. Is that, and I know previous versions may very well work, but it's a requirement by Microsoft that they won't support the environment unless you're on the latest and greatest.
Yeah, and
Correct?
in fact, the other hybrid wizard that is supplied by Microsoft to run that configuration or set up that hybrid checks for that version, so it won't actually run if the version is below a certain level. So it is I mean, while you can manually configure some of these hybrid settings, it's definitely not recommended, and 100% you should be on the latest update for that Exchange version before you run a hybrid.
Yep. Okay.
So once you've got to that sort of prerequisite, there's a couple of other things that you need. One is that you have a couple of DNS records for your Exchange on-prem environment. So Auto-Discover does have to be published externally. There are some organizations who don't do that. And then there also needs to be a hybrid namespace that points to your on-premises Exchange environment, and that needs to be published externally as well. So there just needs to be an Auto-Discover that the DNS record can point users outside of your internal network to your Exchange server, and the same with that hybrid namespace. It needs to be able to get to your on-premises Exchange server. Once you've got those, yeah, it's just a matter of. The other thing is a certificate that is issued by a third-party certificate vendor. So you can't use internal certificates for a hybrid. So that namespace, whatever you use, has to be protected or has to be present on a certificate that's issued by an external or third-party certificate vendor. So that's the prerequisites, pretty much in a nutshell. After that, it's just a matter of running through the hybrid wizard. Now it's basically a utility, a bunch of scripts in the end that Microsoft provide to you. You download it, you run it, preferably from your Exchange server. And the reason that is that because it does use the PowerShell, Exchange PowerShell scripts or commandlets to configure that Exchange hybrid configuration. So yeah, preferably you run it on your Exchange server, and then you basically follow the steps as outlined. Very, very simple process to do that.
Yep. So let's talk real quick about mail flow, because there's a potential decision that needs to be made up front in terms of where you want that mail flow coming in, and whether you want it coming in via M365, or whether you want that, or Exchange Online, or whether you want that inbound to your organization first and then routing up to M365 until you've cut over everyone. So is there a best practice or a preference, or is it really dependent on what the client is interested in doing?
Yeah, well, it definitely is dependent on what the customer has in their environment. There's a couple of scenarios that need to be identified. The first scenario is whether there's some sort of message hygiene system being used, whether that's cloud-based or on-premises. A couple of examples are here. You might have something like Proofpoint or Symantec that you're doing sort of anti-spam, anti-malware for your messaging. So generally, for a cloud-based service, obviously the MX record externally dictates how that message routes to your environment. So for something with a cloud-based service, they'll have an MX record that points to that cloud service. So you wouldn't necessarily change the route that message takes. What you would look at is, and generally what I recommend in a migration scenario is that once you've sort of migrated, half or a bit more than half of your mailboxes, it's worth thinking about where, when, or if you want to change that mail flow. If you've got, say, Proofpoint, you've got your messages coming into Proofpoint. Generally, initially you'll have those messages go to your on-premises Exchange environment, and then from there for a migrated mailbox, that message will then be routed into Exchange Online for that to be delivered to that Exchange Online mailbox. Once you've got a majority of your mailboxes in Exchange Online, in terms of a network utilization perspective, it's worth flipping that around. So instead of bringing your messages coming into your on-prem environment, send it to Exchange Online and then just have those messages that are destined for on-prem mailbox coming into your environment. So you sort of reduce that network utilization and perhaps the bandwidth available as well for other services. The other scenario is if you've got an on-prem message hygiene system. You might have an iron port or something on-prem. In that scenario, it's very similar, except you're always going to have to send or use that network or your on-premises network for message routing, because obviously that hygiene service, if you want to retain it, you need to obviously keep all that mail coming into your on-prem Exchange environment. Now, there are some scenarios where messages also have to go through Exchange, both incoming and outgoing. There's some things like you might have some signaturing software that you've got installed on an Exchange server. You might have some stuff in the that is in that sort of transport layer on an Exchange server. You've got some third-party applications that might do some things to messages on the Exchange server at the transport layer. So there's also a scenario where organizations do have to route both incoming and outgoing mail through your on-premises Exchange server. So that is definitely a scenario that is available to organizations if they have to do it. If we can get around it or move away from it, I would definitely recommend it, because it basically you've then still got your on-premises Exchange environment as a failure point. If something happens to that network or Exchange server, it goes down, incoming, outgoing mail doesn't happen. You can't send or receive mail. So
so there's two things we haven't touched on. One, and I guess this is a prerequisite consideration, would be the UPNs. So if you're internally using as an organization, you're using a .local type domain and everyone logs in with usernames rather than a full UPN. So that would be, username at organization.com. You need to consider implementing a full FQDN UPN for users when you migrate to M365. Another one, I guess, is also Exchange archiving. If you're running on-prem archiving solution, there's broader considerations there about rehydration versus migration of archive mailboxes, these sorts of things. And for what it's worth, we've got a new, we being Incentra, Dan and I both work for Incentra, we've got a new best practice guide for migrating Exchange archived, whether it's Exchange archiving or others, into and complex archiving into Exchange Online. So we've got a great, as I said, a great guide that we'll provide a link to in the show description or the show notes. But let's talk for a minute about the UPNs and archiving. What, generally speaking, for smaller organizations, they'll either be using native Exchange archiving or more than likely no archiving, but larger organizations will, be leveraging everything from EV to, others. What's the general approach there?
Yeah, well, so that's a good thing to bring up, was the UPNs, because one of the things that we didn't, or I didn't mention as a prerequisite in particular for a hybrid migration, is that you do need to be syncing your users from on-premises Active Directory into Azure AD. Now, that's usually run as part of using AAD Connect. That's a tool. It's basically a cut-down tool of Microsoft Identity Manager. And it just simplifies that synchronization of users from on-prem to Azure Active Directory. Now, generally, organizations sort of sit into one of two categories with their on-prem Active Directory. They either have a dot local or a dot something name for their on-prem Active Directory. So
So I guess a non-routable
a
domain.
non-routable, correct? Yeah. So
Yep.
it's business.local as their Active Directory main. And most organizations, they don't change the UPNs for their users. It's really not. On-premises Active Directory still uses UPNs, but it's not really seen by the end user or even by admins. Most users
No.
just use their sort of SAMA account name and log into their workstations or log into applications and stuff using that SAMA account name. So it's sort of hidden away. Other organizations, they do use an internet routable name for their Active Directory. So they have, for example, incentragroup.com as their domain name. So that by default will be their UPN. Now, when you use AAD Connect, you can only sync a UPN that has an internet routable domain name. So for instance, if you had incentragroup.com, then everything would be fine. Every user would then be synced with an incentragroup.com UPN. Unfortunately, if you don't, then you're going to have to change your UPNs. Now, there's some other ways that you can do it. If you must keep a .local or a non-routable domain name, but strongly recommend that you configure users with an internet routable domain name. Now, the other consideration here is around a user experience consideration. Because UPN is what's used by Microsoft 365 services to log. Now, there is some stuff coming around where SMTP addresses could be used. There's some previews that are being used. There's some things that don't work with that preview at the moment, so it's not strongly recommended. I still strongly recommend using the UPN to log in. Now, the user experience I was just talking about is where a user, they know their email address. Everyone knows what their email address generally is. Users don't necessarily know, and the email address doesn't have to match their UPN. So if you don't have a matching UPN and email address, that means the user has to remember two things. They have to remember their email address, and then they have to remember their UPN when they're logging in. So one thing I strongly recommend for organizations is that UPNs match email addresses. That way the user doesn't have to remember two different things. As I said, hopefully Microsoft will come along and you'll be able to use SMTP addresses, so an email address to log in, but at that stage, it's not quite there. So that's the thing with sort of that directory or identity. It's a discussion that will be had as part of that migration if they haven't already done. So with archiving, it's if you've got on-premises archiving, generally the majority of organizations that we see, or a lot of it is around EV or Enterprise Vault.
Yep.
It's probably one of the biggest tools that organizations have used. Now, yeah, as you say, we've got a one of the best sort of migrations team for that sort of space in on the planet. They've been doing it since Incentra was born recently. 12 years. They've got
12 odd years ago. Yeah. Yep.
Sort of migrations. And yeah, really strong in that space. And it's a discussion around, some organizations want to keep Enterprise Vault, some don't. Microsoft, if you've got a licensed mailbox, you have, a pretty big archive available to you, and it's cloud-based. So, if you've got on-premises EV, you've got storage that you've got to supply, you've got servers you've got to maintain, you've got also, mail routing for journaling and all that kind of stuff that you have to maintain. And so there's a lot of stuff that you can, get rid of a lot of that on-premises stuff. There's a part of that migrations, might have stubs in your, in your in your
Yep.
Outlook, which is basically a pointer to a message that's gone into Enterprise Vault. It's not a full message. It's just a pointer.
Yep.
So things like that need to be addressed, because once you've migrated to Exchange Online, those pointers don't work anymore. So you need to take that into account, how that journaling works, how that archiving works, archiving rules, and that sort of thing. So yeah, that will be discussed as part of obviously the design and how the organisation wants to move, or if the organisation wants to move away from on-prem archiving and journaling to a cloud-based solution.
And I guess whether they can, so there may be regulatory requirements
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that mean, or BCP type requirements where the organisation
Yeah.
says no, we want to keep some
Yep.
stuff on prem,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Sure.
the solution can cater for that, right?
Yeah.
So
Now, one of the things with specifically around journaling is Exchange Online. Actually, you can definitely journal using Exchange Online. You can't use an Exchange Online mailbox though for journaling.
no,
So
it can't. It's not
that's a
cyclical. Yeah.
correct. Yeah. So you really need to think about how you want that journaling to look as part of the solution as well. So you might need a third party. You might need to retain some sort of on-premises infrastructure to sort of have that journaling
Yep.
go on. So that's something to think about as well.
Yep.
Well, I was going to say something else, but I forgot totally what it was.
Oh well, that happens. If it comes back to you, let me know.
Oh no, well, I remember now. No, so
Oh, there we go.
you mentioned before around sort of legal requirements and stuff like that. Now, one of the things that the tooling that we use to do that sort of archive migration takes into account those legal requirements, and you have a chain of custody that is documented as part of that. You can see legally that there's no changes to messages as part of that migration.
Yep.
Through that chain of custody view and reporting that we do when we do those migrations. So that's critical in those type of migrations for a lot of businesses. It is a legal requirement for a lot of organisations to can't be any point where the message can
Yep.
prove that this is the message that that the person received or that we've journaled and archived. So we do have that chain of custody view as well.
Cool. So I think we've got people into the cloud. They've migrated their exchange. Are there any best practices that? I mean, we've touched on them, I guess, over the course of the discussion. But is there anything else? Because we're sort of getting to the end now. We've got them into the cloud. They're all done. We
nothing else to do.
shake of hands. I mean, with the exception of, and again, this will be an underlying theme through many episodes of this podcast. But one suggestion I would always make for internal resources who are either looking at doing the migration themselves, or will be taking over ownership and management of it, is go and learn PowerShell.
Yes.
PowerShell is critical in just modern Windows-based, Microsoft-based technology. So that would be, I would. My recommendation is always go and learn PowerShell. But what other best practices or aspects to Exchange Online, I guess, in particular, and that migration process?
Yeah, well, I guess there comes a time when a lot of organizations want to get rid of their on-prem Exchange servers totally. So you've moved your mailboxes to Exchange Online. So what do you do on-prem now? Up until sort of a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, actually. So it's the latest version of Exchange latest CU of Exchange 2019. Before that, you had to keep an Exchange server on-prem to manage that hybrid scenario.
That was mainly due to AD attributes and these sorts of things, right? Yeah.
100%, yeah. So what you're doing with that sort of AAD Connect is syncing users from on-prem to Azure AD So what that means is that the sort of source of truth, I guess, for those AD accounts is your on-premises environment, because all of those settings are synced from on-premises. So you need to be able to have tools to manage those attributes. Now, Microsoft only support managing Exchange attributes using Exchange tools, which means the sort of the Exchange management shell and the Exchange management website, the
Yep.
ECP.
Yep.
Up until a couple of weeks ago, that meant you had to have Exchange Server on-prem. So now with the latest version of 2019, you get to use Exchange management tools without actually physically having Exchange Server on premises. So
Right.
you can install, basically it's just the PowerShell commandlets on a management server. It can be any server.
So jump box
And
or something like
yeah,
that. Yep.
correct, an admin box, anything like that. So the thing, as you mentioned before, though, is that it's purely PowerShell management. You don't have the web interface or the ECP present to use a GUI to manage Exchange attributes at all. So as you say, if you want to go down that route, you'd need to be your admin and your sort of help desk and your provisioning teams need to be familiar with those PowerShell, because that's the only thing present.
So
So yeah, definitely recommended,
that,
strongly recommended.
yep.
PowerShell skills.
So that's awesome. So that I'm actually going to, based on that, I'm going to circle back around to earlier in the podcast we were discussing around how to set up the hybrid configuration, etc. Right. So
Yep.
we're now looking at Exchange Server 2019 that supports what is effectively a headless management of Exchange attributes.
Yeah.
So in that scenario, if you're an organization that's running Exchange 2010, 2013, or even 2016,
Yep.
the recommendation there is going to be don't upgrade, right? Because that's a whole other project. Stand up a single Exchange server, running Exchange 2019, migrate through that. So that's your hybrid server.
Yep.
Migrate through that into Exchange Online, which means you can then decommission your Exchange 2010, 2013, 2016 environments,
Yep.
retain that Exchange 2019,
Yep.
and eventually decommission that as well, and just
Yeah,
leverage
that's
the
right.
tools.
Yeah, definitely. Yep. Yeah, and that's definitely a recommended scenario that because the latest versions of the software Exchange have new features and new abilities, I guess. Definitely, if you can go to the latest, it's definitely recommended. Now, obviously, there are some support requirements around 2019. You definitely can't go directly to 2019 with 2010 on-prem because 2010 doesn't support. You can go upwards of 2 versions. So 2010, you can go up to, you can go 2013, 2016.
Yep.
You can't go above that. So 2013 and onwards, you can go to a sort of 2019 server. Now one thing on that as well is that there has been some announcements from Microsoft that they're not producing a new version of Exchange for a few years now.
Right.
They've had some delays. I think a lot of their development or engineering team were sort of seconded a few months ago to address a lot of those security issues that occurred with Exchange. So yeah, they've sort of put the new version of Exchange on the back burner a little bit because of that delay. So yeah, there won't be a new version of Exchange, I believe, until sort of 2024, 25 sort of
Right.
time period.
Yep.
So yeah, it's worth thinking about 2019 as the next version to go to, for sure.
Oh, good.
So yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right. There was something that I was going to say, and now I've forgotten it. So it's my turn to be, to have that sort of moment of senility.
One of the things I will say is a lot of the reasons people keep Exchange Server around is for a bit of sort of like message relaying.
Yep.
So you might have some devices or applications that do relay. Your printers that are sort of scan to email and some
Monthly reports out of your HR or payroll.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly right. They send emails directly. Now, traditionally, that's been a relay connector on your Exchange server. Now, that's a very valid reason to keep Exchange around on-prem. You can definitely configure those devices and applications to relay through Exchange Online, so that's worth thinking about.
Yep.
And there's also the option of using the Edge Transport option as well.
Yep.
Now, Edge Transport reduces the size of the Exchange install. It doesn't have that sort of bigger IIS install, and so some of the security risks Exchange are mitigated by just using an Edge Transport, and you can have a relay on that as well. You can configure a relay on that as well.
Yep.
So there's two options. I personally would recommend, if you can do it, relaying directly through Exchange Online. Again, it sort of mitigates the risk of an on-premises failure occurring and not getting those messages. So it's sort of I think it's a better option or a more redundant option, or has more redundancy in that option. But there are definitely some reasons to keep that around. And I think one of the good things about a hybrid that I haven't mentioned before is that Microsoft do offer a hybrid license for your Exchange version. So you don't need to, if you haven't got any mailboxes on-prem, you're only using it for management or you're only using it for relaying of messages, you don't need to buy an Exchange license. They will give you a license for that as well. So
that's what I was going to mention before, and then I forgot, was the licensing. Yeah.
So that's a good thing. But I mean, as I said, you still need an OS license, but you don't need to pay for an Exchange license if that's all you're doing with your Exchange on-prem box.
That's also another reason to look at relaying through Office 365 Exchange Online, is because it reduces the cost of on-prem infrastructure down to zero.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, definitely. Yeah. Now, depending on the type of relay, you may need, to have a license in Exchange Online. If they need a mailbox or something like that, some applications are required to log into a mailbox and do that relaying, or there's some requirements around that. So you may need a license, but you definitely reduce your on-premises licensing costs if you can get rid of those servers as well.
Cool. I think that's it. I think we're good. I think we're done.
Cool.
I'm hoping that our listeners have got something out of that. Again, I will mention again the guide that we've got out, the best practice guide for Exchange archiving. So as I mentioned earlier, there will be a link in the description or in the show notes. Depends whether you're listening or watching. I think we're good. Dan, thanks for joining me today. This was
pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This was good. Yeah, I'll have to have you on more often.
You will
talk about Exchange and Microsoft 365 stuff.
All the good stuff.
Yeah.
None of that other stuff.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be back again next week, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks everyone. Cheers.